Thank you all for being here. I'm Richard Fontaine. I'm the president of the Center for New American Security. And on behalf of CNAS and in cooperation with the Guam U.S. Security Alliance, or GWASA, I want to welcome you to this public forum where we're going to look at the rebalance to Asia and get a status report from various perspectives, the expert perspective, the congressional perspective, the executive branch perspective, and hear about the various dimensions of U.S. defense and foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific region. The timing here, as I probably don't have to tell you, is pretty important, with the region quite literally on the move. To cite just a few examples, the negotiations over the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement are entering the final stages in Congress. We'll have a key role in considering both TPP and Trade Promotion Authority. China has prompted concern with the land reclamation activities and building activities in the South China Sea. Japanese Prime Minister Abe will soon address a joint session of Congress, making him the first Japanese leader ever to do so. North Korea is ever provocative and uncertain, and the result of all of this is that the demand for U.S. engagement in the Asia-Pacific region is higher today than it has been in decades. At CNAS, we've been dedicated to thinking about what this engagement should look like. We're interested in a comprehensive strategy, one that brings together economics and trade, diplomacy, and defense policy. We've recently completed a series of reports focused on how to counter challenges of coercion and gray zone activities in maritime Asia, and we're about to release a major study on Chinese foreign policy. We're also examining how to establish a sustainable defense policy, balancing near-term means aimed at reassurance and deterrence with long-term capabilities aimed at preserving America's ability to see a continuation of the open global commons, even in the face of growing anti-access and area denial capabilities. And as we'll discuss today, we're keenly concerned with the need to maintain sufficient capabilities and work more closely with our allies and partners. Our program today will kick off with an hour-long panel on regional and maritime strategy, followed by 4 separate series of remarks by Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs Kelly Magsamen, Senator John McCain, Congressman Matt Salmon, and Representative Madeleine Bordallo. We will conclude with a second panel that will focus on issues related to U.S. presence, force posture, and the role of the Marianas. All of today's program, with the exception of the remarks from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, will be on the record. And now I'd like to turn to our panel's first chairman, Paul Giarra. Paul's president of his own security consulting business. He's a retired naval officer, and he's been a regular contributor to CNAS's Asia program research activities. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Congressman Bordallo, ladies and gentlemen, it's very good to see you here. I know that some of you had real trouble getting here because of the parades in Washington, D.C. today. And actually, one of our panelists is still on the way, but he'll come right up to the podium. And we're looking forward to seeing him. Tom Mahnken is among a distinguished group of panelists, experts, colleagues, and friends. I look very much forward to their remarks. Their remarks are going to, as Richard Fontaine just said, talk about regional and maritime strategy. Please keep in mind in these broader remarks the issue of Guam and where Guam fits there. This is the third time we've come together with our friends from GWASA, the Guam U.S. Asia Security Alliance. The first time was in Guam, and it brought together American experts, and we all went to Guam and talked about some of the issues you'll hear about today. The second meeting was also in Guam, and then we brought American experts, but we also brought regional contributors from the region. That was very interesting, and to a person, they all said, this is really great getting here together in Guam and talking about these issues, and it really was. The outcome, I thought, was very interesting and I think important. Today, we've brought the show here to Capitol Hill, and what we're trying to do is look at these broader issues in this first panel and then concentrate just a little bit more on Guam specifically in the second panel. We're going to take this panel from Patrick Cronin on to my right, and I will introduce each of them very, very briefly because time is of the essence. We've given them each 5 minutes, and if you think it's hard to say this stuff in 5 minutes, talk about trying to get them to stop at 5 minutes. That's the hard part. So we're going to start now. Patrick Cronin is my old friend and dear colleague of 25 years standing. He's a stalwart, not just at CNAS. And by the way, let me say, it's no surprise that CNAS brings you these issues and that CNAS has been part of this Guam process. And the reason is because it's so logical that and it's so typical that CNAS is right in the middle of these. I just wanted to acknowledge that. Now, Patrick is a stalwart at CNAS. He's the vice president for Asia, but he's also a steam engine in trousers. He's everywhere. He's peripatetic. He's on the road as often as he is here in Washington. Patrick, 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Let me try to frame some of the pivotal strategic issues in maritime Asia, and I'm conscious that I'm leaving out more than I will leave in. So issues like the Korean Peninsula, we have huge things to say about that, very important projects, not today. 5 points. First, whatever the status of the rebalance to Asia, it remains arguably the most grand strategic element of the Obama administration's foreign policy. So I think reasonable people can disagree over its debut, its follow-through, its resourcing, but the basic framework remains valid if the United States wishes to adapt an overall successful post-World War II order and perpetuate prosperity and stability for decades to come. Now, the CNAS chairman of the board, Kurt Campbell, likes to say that most of the history of the 21st century will be written in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region. But to shape the peace and build order, as well as to deter and defend conflict and dissuade coercion, the United States needs to step up its engagement comprehensively in the rising and dynamic region of the world. So the rebalance deserves attention not only during the last 2 years of the Obama administration, but also during the administrations to follow, regardless of which party occupies the White House. My second point is that it is not so much China's rise that has unsettled some of the regional security, but rather some of China's behavior. The immediate challenge is less the threat of conflict than the prospect of placing coercion above the value of the rule of law. China is advancing its influence across its maritime frontiers, operating often in the gray zones beneath a level of assertiveness that would trigger clear defensive responses. This is not new. China is not the sole offender, and it was indeed the much maligned Hu Jintao who called for building China into a maritime power. But China's confidence and capacity to assert influence rather than simply hide and bide has accelerated under Xi Jinping. Dr. Ely Ratner, the deputy head of the Asia program at CNAS, has a big project that will be forthcoming very soon, looking at the future direction of Chinese external policy. Anyway, meanwhile, over the last few years, we've been looking at rising tensions in maritime Asia at CNAS. We've called attention to what we have dubbed tailored coercion. And over the past 6 or 7 years, we've seen China contesting Japan's administrative control of its Southwest Islands, China promoting a 9-dash-line map covering most of the South China Sea, the PLA sometimes harassing ships and planes while resisting attempts to create a binding code of conduct and uphold international law. We've seen China trying to enlarge its maritime sphere of influence, whether through the declaration of an East China Sea air defense identification zone, the use of a flotilla of military and paramilitary vessels to defend deep-sea drilling rigs in disputed waters, or more recently, the rapid construction of artificial islands in the Paracel and Spratlys. Admiral Harris has memorably dubbed this China's Great Wall of Sand. My third point is that while we need to engage and accommodate China, we also need to impose costs on certain types of unacceptable behavior. These are not in contradiction. We need to do both. This past year, I've been leading a CNAS project on cost-imposing strategies for dealing with maritime coercion. We've produced 9 papers. Tom Mahnken has written one of them. Ely Ratner has contributed in many ways to the whole project, as has Paul Giarra. Alex Sullivan and I wrote a capstone report. All of these can be found online. And among other things, we recommend, in addition to a strong U.S. presence in the region, including full use of Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, we recommend imposing diplomatic, reputational, and legal costs on unilateral changes to the status quo. We recommend helping allies and partners to build up a minimal level of defensive and coastal defense capacity to avoid creating tempting opportunities that might be exploited. We recommend creating greater information sharing, including both shared maritime domain awareness with key allies and partners and a wider regional common operating picture for transparency and cooperation across a range of contingencies, beginning with humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. We're going to be doing a lot more work on these issues. And we also recommended engaging in a relentless pursuit of effective ways, effective diplomacy, bilaterally and multilaterally, to reduce the chance of accidental conflict, dampen potential escalation, and build trust and build cooperation. My fourth point, very briefly, is that while we manage the gray zone situations and tailored coercion in the short term, we have to be investing in defense and diplomatic strategies to preserve reassurance and deterrence in the face of growing A2AD, anti-access area denial capabilities in the region. My colleague, Shawn Brimley, Jerry Hendricks on the next panel, Tom Mahnken on this panel will all have more to say about this, I'm sure. My fifth and final point is to underscore that cost-imposing strategies, including third offset strategies for the long term, for preserving our power projection, must necessarily remain nested inside a larger grand strategy of rebalancing. This is why the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for instance, is more important than the number of Marines on rotational training in Darwin or the 4 littoral combat ships that will be in Singapore by the end of 2017, although those are very important reassurance, deterrence means. We must dissuade others from resorting to coercion and aggression, but we also must be erecting a positive, prosperous, inclusive, rules-based system for the long term. In other words, we have to hedge and build defense, but we also must engage and bind. We must expand cooperation while we manage competition. China has these two seemingly contradictory goals. It wants to grow, but it also wants to expand. Well, we also must cooperate and accommodate, but we also must impose costs on unacceptable behavior. So in this way, in closing, strength and cooperation are two sides of the same coin for the United States. A strong defense is the best insurance for a grand strategy of rebalancing. So let me end with a quote from President Xi Jinping. If you want to work with iron, you must be tough yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. That from one of the toughest guys in Washington. Ely Ratner is a senior fellow at CNAS. He's also the deputy director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program that Patrick runs. He's worked on the China desk at State Department. He's been an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation, and he's been a professional staff member, and I think he knows these rooms well at the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Ely.
Great, thanks, Paul. I'm going to build upon Patrick's comments to talk a little bit about 3 quick points about how to think about, or how I think about Chinese assertiveness in maritime Asia, which I think is at the root of a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So let me run down 3 points, and I'll try to use no more than 5 minutes. The first point is that Chinese assertiveness, which I would define as using military, economic, and diplomatic coercion to advance its political goals, is real. It's an empirical fact. And among the 9 papers, working papers that we recently did at CNAS, I would commend to you Chris Young from NDU's paper, which is to date the most comprehensive analysis of incidents in the South China Sea, a very detailed, including China and all others in the region. And what that data analysis shows is that what China's doing is really unprecedented in scale and scope. And Beijing likes to argue that others are doing it, they're late to the game. And in part that's true, but the reality is that what China is doing now is having strategic effects on the security environment in Asia in ways that others' behavior has not. And I'm concerned that this is trending toward a more unstable and dangerous security environment. So point number 1, Chinese assertiveness is real, which gets to my second point, which is that we all need to do a much better job and be clearer about the ways in which this assertiveness, China's behavior that Patrick talked about, is challenging American interests. And I've been as guilty about this as anyone, but there has been a lot of admiring the problem in the U.S. foreign policy community over the last couple years, talking about what China's doing, putting photos on the front page of the New York Times, even talking about how they might use some of these features with less analysis about specific implications for the United States and for U.S. interests. And one of the recommendations that I've been making is that I think one of the things that we all need to contribute to is to paint a much clearer picture for American policymakers and for decision makers in the region about the long-term implications of some of this behavior being allowed to continue. And the reason that's important is not only for our own understanding, but for U.S. foreign policy making, to understand what's really at stake and to situate these issues of Chinese assertiveness and maritime Asia within both the way we prioritize these issues within China policy itself, as well as within broader U.S. foreign policy. I'm trying to elevate the importance of these issues and help understand, I think what most people on the panel would agree, very serious implications across economic, military, and political domains. Which gets to my third point, which is that I would argue that we need to be more sophisticated in how we think about and how we talk about risk. And to date, in terms of our China policy, there's been a huge emphasis, and rightly so, on managing the U.S. competition with with China, avoiding inadvertent conflict, avoiding a deleterious strategic rivalry. And what we've seen out of this, and this is very important, has led to better mill-mill engagements, confidence-building measures, and other crisis management mechanisms. But I'm concerned that our policy and the way that we talk about it, that we've wrapped ourselves around the axle of what academics would call power transition theory, which portends inevitable conflict between rising powers and established powers, and we've structured our policy to avoid that outcome, to avoid the Thucydides trap, again, as it's called. And the Chinese version of this is the new type of major power relations concept, that the main goal of U.S.-China relations and U.S.-China policy is to avoid rivalry and reduce the risk of conflict as the top priority. But I would argue that rivalry is not the only threat to U.S. interests in Asia and not the only threat to the international community and to countries in the region, and that equally pernicious to long-term U.S. interests would be an environment in which risk aversion and a desire to avoid tensions led to a Chinese sphere of influence in maritime Asia. And the more China is able to expand its effective control over the South China Sea, the harder it's going to be to reverse these unilateral actions. So in a sense, risk aversion today is actually only elevating the risk of conflict tomorrow and elevating the forcefulness of the required U.S. response to reverse those actions. So I'll just leave by saying, as we think about how the United States and others to respond to this, that we can't be overly focused on risk reduction alone, when in fact there are times when escalation and introducing risk and tolerating tension will be necessary to demonstrate American resolve and to protect U.S. interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eli. That was very powerful. The next panelist is Bryan McGrath. Bryan McGrath, if he could grow a beard, would be a Navy strategy graybeard. He's the primary author of the 2007 Maritime Strategy. He is a loud and clear voice on naval issues in Washington. He is the founding director of Ferry Bridge Group, and he's also the deputy director of maritime issues at the Hudson Institute. Bryan?
Thank you. My ability to grow beard has never been questioned. I may have to. As I watch the guest list grow for this event today, I made a special prayer to the Supreme Being that he might lock us all in here because of the unique talents available. Throw pizzas in once or twice a day for 3 weeks, and I think we would have most of the country's problems solved between the people out there and the people that will speak today. I want to talk about three things. The first is the key facets of the new maritime strategy just released by our nation's maritime services. Secondly, how I believe that document will be interpreted by China. And third, what does that mean? Let's start with the new maritime strategy. First of all, when it's a new maritime strategy, that is because it replaces one that was written in 2007. This new document is a harder-edged, more operationally oriented document than its predecessor, which had grandiose directions, and it attempted to form itself as grand strategy in disguise. This one has no such pretense. It is a military strategy. It was necessary because the strategic environment has changed, obviously, right? I mean, we see now this return of great power dynamics, number one, and on the second hand, we have the fiscal environment that we have to operate within. The document called itself or billed itself as a refresh, but it really is a new strategy. It walks away pretty much completely from that grandiosity of its predecessor, and it is, as I said, a service strategy. 4 important tenets to take away from it that Brian Clark and I identified in an article a couple weeks ago. The first is an elevation of the electromagnetic spectrum to a level co-equal in warfighting with the other more traditional pursuits of the United States Navy and our maritime forces. Second is this desire to squeeze more forward presence out of the forces that we have, even if, and it doesn't say this in the document, even if those forces decline in size. Third is an emphasis on achieving greater flexibility, adaptability, and modularity in naval forces. And finally, and this is the most important, it's the establishment of that gaining and maintaining access is the key contribution of maritime forces to joint warfighting. Gaining and maintaining access. Who might be in the way of that access? The previous document talked about defending a global system. Who might you ask? Against who are we defending it? Anyone that messes with it. Anybody that wants to cause problems. In this case, the problem set is dramatically focused. It's who wishes to deny us the use of the sea? Who wishes to deny like-minded nations freedom of the seas? Broadly understood, this means primarily Iran, North Korea, but necessarily China. The question is, how will China react to having been called out like this? We have some historical analog as we look back to 2007. We released a strategy in the fall. There is a garrulous, rich community of unclassified thinkers in China who immediately started to chatter about the new maritime strategy. They believed that its cooperative nature was primarily a way for us to veil containment. They believed that it was aimed, that this desire to protect and sustain a global system was in order to protect our fundamental leading role in that system, which I agree with that interpretation. Given the reaction to the relatively pacific document that was the 2007 strategy, pun intended, Chinese writers will have a field day with this one. Battalions of unhinged senior colonels will claim encirclement, will complain about American aggression, and they will point to all manner of salubrious benefits to the region of a more powerful and widely dispersed PLA Navy, while denying that such a Navy is of any real threat to the nations around them with whom they have ongoing disputes. At the same time, there is likely to be a very a stream of pride that all of the work that the PLA Navy and the land-based component of sea control that the PLA operates are being taken so seriously by the U.S. Navy and its maritime forces. This is, of course, true, but in all things there are unintended consequences. So what's next? Number one, China's going to keep doing what it's doing. I don't think we have any reason to believe that they're going to stop with some of the coercive acts that both Patrick and Ely have already talked about. I think they're going to continue to make qualitative improvements in their forces in the region, and they will continue to slowly make quantitative. China does not have to build a Navy that's bigger than our Navy. Anybody who tells you that is wrong. They just have to build a Navy that's bigger than the Navy we can put in their backyard and sustain in their backyard for long periods of time. That, I believe, is their aim. They'll continue with their environmentally friendly land reclamation activities. They will continue to aggressively assert claims. I believe they will begin to branch out in where they are influencing, eventually getting to South America and Central America. And I believe that China will continue its place, somebody mentioned Thucydides already, in the Millian dialogue, with them acting as the big power. What do we do? What do we and our allies do? First of all, I think the work of Pat Cronin and his team at CNAS on the coercive aspects of what they're doing and the recommendations is clear thinking and very straightforward. We have to be able to understand the dynamics of escalation. We have to think through with our allies in advance pre-planned responses that are like Ely said, not worried solely about not escalating, but understanding what the aim of escalation might in fact be. I would like to see us at some diplomatic level declaring that these reclamation efforts, they're obviously military forward operating bases to extend a defensive perimeter, that we should make sure they understand that we do not consider them to be downtown targets. These are legitimate military targets. This is not mainland China, and the cottage industry of analysts in the United States who get weak-kneed in fear about nuclear retaliation if we drop a bomb on a radar on the Chinese mainland, their fears should be somewhat quieted by a policy that says these don't count. These are not part of that regime. Bottom line is I think great power dynamics are back on the menu. We must continue to alter our thinking and unlimber the intellectual might necessary to compete in this world. I think Ely alluded to that. And as a final act of desperation, I will cry out once again in the wilderness here in this building that our Congress and the White House must stop looking at our nation's defense as just another domestic discretionary program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bryan. That was really great. I think a lot about the maritime strategy. I worked in the maritime strategy office on the Navy staff many, many years ago, back around when Perry went to Japan. That is Admiral Perry, not Secretary of Defense Perry. These are important issues. The Navy is, I must say, not quite sure about what all this means, despite the clarity of what Bryan McGrath has said. When asked what the threat drivers were at the recent rollout of the maritime strategy here in Washington, C.N.O. Greenert apparently pointedly did not mention China. So that's something to keep in mind. Shawn Brimley is the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at CNAS. Most recently, before that, he was the Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council at the White House. I can't think of anybody better to address these issues.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks to my co-panelists. I'll try to stay significantly under 5 minutes because my panelists, and I'm sure Dr. Mahnken as well, will reinforce a lot of the points that I would make. I would just make 3 brief points and maybe some specific recommendations as I think about the audience here on Capitol Hill. As a defense sort of civilian, I'll give you the perspective that I would hope and expect that folks, my counterparts in OSD, for instance, are thinking about. And this is also informed by the time we spent at CNAS with Bob Work while he was CEO and is now Deputy Secretary of Defense. I think from a military perspective, we need to look at what's actually happening in the Asia Pacific from a military perspective. And I would simply say, from a military perspective, what's happening is we are making a rapid shift from an era of unguided warfare, of unguided weapons, to the era of guided weapons. And this is when you might have heard folks talk about this offset strategy planning going on at the Pentagon. That's really what they're talking about. That's really what I think Bob Work and, to a certain degree, Secretary Carter are thinking about as well. We have lived for 25 years in an era where the United States had a dominant military technological advantage in things like stealth and ISR and GPS and the ability to use precision munitions at a time and place of our choosing. And that technological advantage has bequeathed us a huge opportunity over the last 25 years to be the dominant power, what some called a decade ago, a unipolar world. That era is over, and we see that most significantly, I would argue, in the Asia Pacific, where China, for instance, is making significant measured advancements, and they've spent more than a decade plus traveling down this path. And if you're a defense planner in the Pentagon, if you're a war planner, one of the fundamental assumptions you're making is that we will no longer have guided weapons parity in a potential contingency. And that colors everything insofar as we think about U.S. military posture in the Asia-Pacific, how we think about crisis stability, how we think about deterrence. And so as we think about U.S. posture and presence, think about that. How do we make sure that our men and women in uniform and our allies and partners in the region can live and fight and win in a world in which precision munitions are now fully proliferated? It's what Dr. Andrew Marshall used to call the maturation of the precision strike regime. And that's really, I think, a fundamental dynamic that we all need to think about. So if that's true, what are some specific things that the Pentagon is thinking about? I would argue as part of their offset strategy, for instance. And I would say there are 4. There are a lot more, but these are the ones that I tend to focus on. Making sure our carriers are relevant in those kinds of contingencies. That's why this debate about unmanned systems off the carrier, U-class or UCAV as some call it, that's really important. That speaks directly to how we can project and sustain power in the Asia-Pacific. The decision coming up on the next-gen bomber, that's really important because we need systems that can be able to penetrate the kinds of A2AD networks that we see in the Asia-Pacific. That's really fundamentally important as you think about the Asia-Pacific. Submarines. We need to preserve our advantage in submarine warfare. I think Dr. Hendricks and others will talk about this in the panels to come. And also directed energy. Part of the maturation of the precision strike regime is we need to figure out how to defend against our adversaries having precision weapons, okay? And that means when we talk about theater missile defense in places like Japan, South Korea, this issue is pertinent right now, but all the way through, we need to think about how our allies and partners can defend themselves in this regime. But I would also say another important facet of this is this is not just about what we acquire, this is about how our allies and partners in the Asia-Pacific, the platforms and capabilities that they acquire. And that's a place, I think, of great opportunity for the Pentagon and for Congress and the national security community writ large. We need to make sure our export control regimes are such that we can get these kinds of systems into the hands of our allies and partners. They can learn how to use these things, and they can integrate into our own architecture so we can work together with them in peace and during periods of tension and, heaven forbid, in an actual conflict. And finally, I would say, part of this directly relates to forward posture, that we need to think about a posture that is more resilient, that is more agile, and that is more dispersed in an era where we see this maturation of the precision strike regime. The Pentagon has this construct, operationally resilient, geographically distributed, and politically sustainable. I think that's the right construct, but we need to think about how that construct applies to a world where actors are going to have these advanced military technologies and can employ them in peace and in war. So some specific recommendations. I have failed. I have 10 seconds left, but some specific recommendations for folks here on Capitol Hill. I think you ought to think about tying the interests of the Asia-Pacific to what the Pentagon talks about when they talk about their offset strategy. You need to think about how these potential acquisitions like unmanned systems off the carrier, directed energy, submarines fit into a strategy for the Asia-Pacific. Push aggressively for more improvement in export controls. We've seen some recent improvement lately, but we need to push harder. I want our allies and partners in the Pacific acquiring unmanned systems from us, not others. I think you need to push DoD to suggest practical, affordable posture options for increasing our access and basing with regional partners. And also try to be open when that answer comes in part with the implication of some overseas military construction fees. Be open to that because it's critical. And finally, try to pay attention to and elevate the discussion around DoD's forthcoming reports on maritime security and the congressionally mandated reports on maritime security and also the broader Asia strategy. Don't let those reports lie fallow. Use that opportunity to raise and elevate to the debate. Congress asked for these reports, and so I think you should use the opportunity to focus the discussion around them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Shawn. That was very clear, and I especially enjoyed hearing those recommendations, which I think are very salient. Tom Mahnken, as these other gents are, is an old friend of mine. He's also one of the most patient men in Washington because he edited a book chapter that I wrote. In addition to that major accomplishment, he's also a professor at the Naval War College. He's a professor at SAIS, and he is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning, and is a real a thought leader in these issues. Tom?
Thanks, Paul. And thanks to you and thanks to all the organizers for putting this event together. I think it's a particularly important event because I believe what we need and what has heretofore often been lacking is a forthright discussion of these issues. Now, as I approach these issues, I do so with a caveat that everything I'm going to say is my view and my view alone, but these definitely are my views. We need a forthright discussion because in a town that can be impolite, sometimes downright rude, we are often too polite when we talk about our interests and we talk about threats to those interests. And that's to our detriment because obfuscation of expression hinders the formulation and implementation of sound strategy. And the need for sound strategy, I think, has not been greater in recent years than it is now. Patrick, at the very outset of the panel, raised the issue of the rise of China and the threat that it poses to U.S. interests in the Asia-Pacific region. And he correctly noted that it really isn't the rise of China per se. I would agree with that, and I would urge us to really think specifically and tangibly what it is that concerns us and concerns our allies and concerns our friends about China's rise, because it's only by understanding those things that we can think about the strategy to deal with them. And I'll argue that there are really 4 aspects of China's rise that are of concern. First, the fact that China is today much more externally focused than it has been in the past. Second, that China, which has historically been a continental power, has chosen to adopt a maritime orientation in recent decades. Third, that it pursues a revisionist foreign policy. And then finally, ultimately, it's the fact that China has an authoritarian political system that causes concern. We would be less concerned by a China that is internally focused, with a continental orientation, supportive of the status quo, and more pluralistic. A China that was growing at the same rate that China is growing today, with a GNP that China has today, that was more internally focused, more continentally focused, more supportive of the status quo, and more pluralistic, would be less of a concern. As a matter of fact, I just described India. Another great power, another rising power with whom we enjoy actually very, very good relations. So any strategy for dealing with China's rise and the threat that it poses to U.S. interests should be a strategy aimed at moving China in those directions. A strategy of counterpressure, if you will, aimed at making it disadvantageous to pursue disruptive behavior and advantageous to pursue productive behavior. Now, we are in the situation that we are in now because, not just because China has been growing and not just because China has been modernizing its military, but because China has been able to exploit geographic, political, technological, and doctrinal asymmetries to its advantage and to our detriment and to the detriment of our allies. In terms of geography, China has been able to exploit the tyranny of distance, the fact that U.S. allies and U.S. territory, including Guam, are much closer to the Asian mainland than they are to the continental United States. China has exploited a political asymmetry. It's used its military modernization in an attempt to undermine confidence in U.S. security guarantees among U.S. allies and friends. China's exploited technological asymmetries as well, as Shawn and others have pointed out, by developing and deploying a centralized land-based reconnaissance strike system to hold at risk both U.S. theater forces, allied forces, and U.S. power projection forces. And then finally, China has exploited a doctrinal asymmetry They've read our playbook. They have our playbook for how we project power, and they've developed a strategy to try to defeat that. At the tip of the spear is China's development of counter-intervention capabilities, which increasingly constrain our ability to project power and therefore undermine our credibility among allies and friends. Capabilities that impose considerable costs upon us and that have given Beijing momentum in its competition with the United States. So any strategy to respond to that needs to yield an expanded set of U.S. options while constraining those of China. It needs to give us momentum in the competition with China, forcing Beijing to respond to our moves rather than forcing us to respond to their moves, and should impose costs as we do so. So to wrap up, I think if we look at those four areas of imbalance, those four asymmetries, I think you can actually see the seeds of a strategy in response. Geography. Geography in some ways has favored China, but I think in a lot of ways it plays against China. China does not have access to the open ocean. China is, whether by policy or not, China is geographically contained by the so-called First Island chain, made up largely of U.S. allies and U.S. friends. And a lot more can be done to constrain China's access to the open oceans. Politically, the United States enjoys close alliances with some of the most powerful countries in the world. As Shawn has mentioned, I definitely disagree. I definitely agree. We need to deepen our interoperability and cooperation with our allies and cooperation among our allies, make it a lot easier to work together. In terms of technology, we have a strong hand to play here as well, if we only play it, both in terms of developing countermeasures to some of the capabilities that China is deploying, and also investing in the next generation, whether it's autonomous systems, directed energy, you have it. And then finally, we can exploit doctrinal weaknesses as well. We can read their playbook and exploit weaknesses there, whether it's centralization, the existence of low levels of trust within the Chinese military and between the Chinese leadership and the military and so forth. So I think that the seeds of a strategy are out there, and what we need now is a robust, open discussion of the elements of a strategy, a discussion that needs to include Congress, needs to include the American public, but also must include our allies and our friends in the region. Thank you very much.
I don't think I need to point out that you've just heard from these panelists a truly remarkable tour de horizon and recommendations of what to do about this emerging strategic circumstance in the Asia-Pacific. I think, obviously, that, but not alone, Tom Mahnken has done exactly what he set out to do, which is to have a forthright conversation about these issues. And I'm very grateful to Tom and his fellow panelists. In the interest of keeping us on time and preserving some time for your questions, I am not going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator and ask my own question. I've got about 100 of them. So we have about 10 minutes. I want to go until 25 past the hour. Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Maximum is already here, so I want to be gracious to her because her schedule is important. So let's have some questions from the floor. Now, there is no microphone, so when I call on you, please try to speak loudly, and if I repeat your question, it's because I'm doing so for the recorders. Yes, a friend from Vietnam who attended the second GWASA conference in Guam.
My name is and my question to
Speak up, Guam.
My question to Mahnken is that you had mentioned about U.S. ability to exploit China's weaknesses. So could you please go further on that? What areas and how the U.S. can do that?
The question is to Tom Mahnken and how to exploit China's weaknesses.
And how long do I have, Paul? Look, I think for a long time, both in Washington and in sort of the defense community more broadly, there was a tendency to downplay China's military capabilities. The big questions, going back a number of years as well, is China capable of fielding a modern military? I think more recently, fortunately, there's been a correction. Unfortunately, I think it's a correction that in some ways overshoots. And now, instead of being 6 inches tall, they're 10 feet tall. And I would say that whether it's China or the United States or dare I say Vietnam, there are strengths and there are weaknesses. And good strategy is made through assessing, through understanding relative strengths and weaknesses. I would, in lieu of giving you my own extensive view of this, I would refer you to the most recent report released by the U.S. China Security and Economic Development Commission that was written by a number of scholars working with the RAND Corporation that lays out a number of the weaknesses of the PLA. I mean, I think that's a good starting point.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. Next question.
Hi, Ely Ratner with the Congressional Research Service. You all. I was curious to hear what you thought of the Bell and Toomey article about the myth of counter-intervention among Chinese defense scholars. Some people say, yeah, maybe he's right, there's a mirror imaging problem. Others say, well, no, they just call it different things. Maybe we should be looking at active sequence, things like that. So I'd love to hear your reaction.
That's to the entire panel, but Tom, why don't you
I'll say, look, so I'm an educator by profession. I love academic arguments, but that is an academic argument. And I would say first off, I would acknowledge both authors are friends, but it is a rather kind of technical academic argument. What I would say is, the equivalent I would say is, pull out the American doctrine for power projection. Show me the book on power projection. I could show you a lot of doctrine that pertains to it. I'd say this is very much the same on the Chinese side.
Anybody else want to? Bryan?
As I discussed in my talk, there is a large community of commentators in China, so I don't, it's not as if we're trying to divine inscrutable things here. They're very blatant about their aims and their desires. So I don't think the article that you cited was interesting and was certainly thought-provoking, but I'd rather read the USNI report that came out 2 days ago that talked about what their capabilities are, and I'd rather read what the government statements are, what their intent is.
If I could take a reclamo, what I would the other response I would say is, it shouldn't just be scholars who are Mandarin speakers who are weighing in on these issues. One of the great advantages that we have in having this discussion is the Chinese government, the military and its think tanks, writes an enormous amount about these things. If you want to go to Amazon, you can buy on Amazon. Of course, it's in Mandarin, so you do have to know Mandarin. But we should be having these works translated. These translations should be freely available for people to discuss and debate. This is not like the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where the Soviets classified the street maps to Moscow. The PLA publishes an enormous amount of information. The problem is that the interpretation of that information is currently confined to a relatively small group. We need to open that up, and I think that one very good way to do so is to make translations of these documents broadly available.
Patrick?
Yes, we've been talking about the academic article recently by two great academics, Taylor Fravel and Professor Toomey, who've each contributed a great deal to our understanding about China's strategic thought. Taylor Fravel on settling of boundary disputes, very influential work, and Toomey's work looking at how doctrine has kind of set in motion a lot of the operational war plans, very important work. But I agree with the comments that have been made so far to say that the recent article where they say that A2AD doesn't exist in effect, because the Chinese talk about this very differently, is somewhat of an academic argument, because there is no doubt that denying the resupply of Taiwan in a contingency, for instance, is part of China's plan. We have conflicting interests is the real problem. China wants to make it impossible to resupply Taiwan, for instance, just to take one contingency, and the reclamation of reefs in the Paracels and Spratlys, not unrelated. So that's just one area. But having said that, let me just say their contribution extends to the need for holistic strategy. That is to say, China wants to cooperate, they want peace, nobody wants war, we're all in that same boat. They're looking to see how much they can expand their influence, how much will we let them, in effect, within this system. So there's still important to know what they write about these words, even if they're somewhat semantic.
Shawn?
Just very quickly, and without taking anything away from what Tom and Patrick have said, I think you can get a lot of the way there if you just assume, which I think is a fair assumption, that what's happening is we are transitioning into the guided weapons regime, period, full stop. And I think you can get a lot of the way there if you just make that assumption and make some investments on our side and some preparations on our side to fight in a world in which the adversary has achieved or has perceived themselves to achieve something approximating guided weapons parity. So I think I fear a situation where we hold ourselves up because we don't have perfect clarity on intel or perfect clarity on China's strategic intentions. Because if you hold out for that, it's going to be too late, and you're going to miss the window of opportunity to act and make serious investments and move forward.
So far, the questions have been as good as the responses. So thank you very much, Ian. One last question, make it, I hope, and this will have to be a quick one. Please.
I'm Steve Benson, and I'm working with a Littoral Operations Center out in Moderator. Who is there. We're dealing with this close-in, contested, congested, complex environment, land and sea. So the ideas about holistic strategies and the precision missile age. This recent article by Andy about archipelagic defense, and the LOC works archipelagically. What do you think about that in terms of maneuver and mobility of weapons and sensors, land and sea, holistic kind of an approach, where C4ISR is brought in very strongly, layered, and it acts as a deterrent. This goes in line with admirals that have just come out about distributed lethality and taking the offensive. Seems pretty coherent.
Thank you. And the question and the responses have to be shorter than the question. Go ahead, Bryan.
I agree.
I also agree. If you haven't read the article, you should read it.
And this is to clarify, this is Andrew Krepinevich's article on archipelagic defense.
I'll just say, without getting into the specifics, because people are debating these sort of counter-intervention and counter-A2D strategies, I think the long-term strategic answer is to ensure that allies and partners in the region have indigenous deterrence capabilities. And without that, it's not going to be the United States. We're not going to be able to overcome the asymmetry of stakes in the long term. Chinese are going to be effective at picking in that, and they're not going to be effective at picking at it. Countries like Vietnam and the Philippines and others in the region can do it on their own. So the specifics there are important, but the concept itself should be a core part of our strategy.
Patrick?
Just one footnote, and that's why U.S. territory in the Pacific, like Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, is so strategically valuable. I had this discussion with our CEO, Michelle Flournoy, yesterday. It's not just about the training and the exercising and what we have present. It is the geography. It is the strategic value. I'm sure we're going to hear this from Congressman Bordaio later as well. But thank you.
So in closing, let me point out, maps matter. Look at them. Land area in a so-called maritime environment matters. Consider it, take it into account, use it for our own purposes and use it against the purposes of others. To this panel, who never fails to amaze me, thank you very much.